What you're looking at is the central problem we're going to unpack. There is a growing gap between how industries used to define value and how value is actually created today. Old systems rely on legacy logic, rules that made sense in a slower, more physical world. But we now live in a digital economy where outcomes matter more than the process used to get there. This gap is not small. It is reshaping entire industries. And if we don't understand it, we risk defending systems that no longer serve people. This is Steve Koleno, and this is Confidential Remarks. Here's the core mistake: confusing the method with the outcome. In many industries, there is a gatekeeper, a person or system that sits in the middle and says, "This only counts if it goes through me." That's what we call definition gatekeeping. It means rejecting something, not because it lacks value, but because it didn't follow the traditional path. But consumers don't think this way. They care about results. If they get what they need, the method becomes secondary. So the real question is simple. Does the tool define the result, or does the value define the result? And once you ask that honestly, the old logic starts to break. Let's make this real with transportation. The old rule said it's only a ride if it comes from a licensed taxi with a medallion. That's the method. But what actually happened? A person needed to get from point A to point B, and they did. The driver got paid. The trip was completed. So if the outcome happened, does it really matter whether it came from a taxi dispatcher or a mobile app? If we stick to the old rule, we're forced into a ridiculous conclusion that the person is somehow still standing at the curb just because the ride came through a different system. That's how flawed this logic becomes. Now look at lodging. The legacy rule says it's only real lodging if it's booked through a traditional hotel with a front desk and concierge. But what's the actual outcome? A traveler needed a place to sleep, and they slept. The host was paid. Shelter was provided. So ask yourself, if someone sleeps comfortably in a home, does the absence of a front desk mean the stay didn't happen? Of course not. The value was delivered. The method just changed. Now think about media. The old definition says it's only real media if it comes through a cable box. But what actually matters? The viewer watched the show. The story was experienced. The subscription was paid. Streaming didn't remove value. It removed the outdated pipe that delivered it. Saying streaming isn't real media is like saying water isn't real unless it comes through a specific pipe. It confuses the delivery method with the actual experience. Let's move to retail. The legacy rule says it's only real shopping if it happens inside a physical store. But what actually happens today? A product is ordered, delivered, and paid for. The need is met. So if everything that defines a purchase has occurred, does it really matter that no one walked through a store door? If we follow the old logic, we'd have to pretend that trillions of dollars in online purchases somehow aren't real. And that clearly doesn't make sense. Now consider banking. The traditional rule says it's only real banking if it happens inside a branch, with cash or checks. But what actually happens today? Money moves instantly. Payments are completed. Wealth is managed digitally. So if funds are transferred and value is exchanged, does it matter that no one stepped inside a building? The economy doesn't stop just because the method changed. In fact, it moves faster. Finally, look at education. The old rule says it's only real education if it happens in a classroom. But what actually matters? A person learned a skill. They passed a test. They gained knowledge. So if learning happens online or through alternative methods, does that make it less real? Of course not. Knowledge doesn't depend on four walls. It depends on whether understanding was achieved. Now step back and look at the pattern. In every single example, the same thing happened. The legacy system tried to invalidate the new model, not because it lacked value, but because it didn't follow the old process. But in every case, the outcome still happened. Mobility, shelter, content, commerce, financial movement, and knowledge all delivered. Here's the truth. Consumers do not care about the gatekeeper. They care about the result. And when the result is there, the old definition loses its power. So now we bring this back to real estate. In every other industry, we've accepted that value matters more than the method. We don't question ride sharing, streaming, or online banking anymore. So why would we suddenly switch logic here? If the reasoning is flawed everywhere else, it's flawed here too. Real estate is not an exception. It's just the next industry facing the same shift. The legacy definition says a real estate transaction is only valid if it goes through a specific licensed intermediary model. But let's look at reality. A home is sold. A buyer moves in. Money changes hands. Ownership transfers. That means the transaction happened. So if the outcome is complete, the definition must evolve to include the method that made it possible, even if it bypasses the traditional gatekeeper, because economics doesn't protect old systems. It rewards results. This is the conclusion. Value is the only metric that matters. We have to stop defining the gate and start defining the outcome. A transaction is not determined by who stood in the middle. It's determined by whether value was exchanged. And as markets evolve, definitions must evolve with them. Otherwise, we end up forcing reality to fit outdated rules, and that never works. The future belongs to systems that recognize what actually happened, not how it used to happen. This has been Confidential Remarks.